This next, we have a special drop-in guest. He's been a marijuana legalization proponent since the early days, man, since even before I was one. You may know him from the Men's Warehouse, I guarantee it. He's here for you. He's gonna bring up our next speaker. I don't even know if he's looking at me. There he is. Ladies and gentlemen, George Zimmer.
Well, good morning, everybody. It's great to be here with such a distinguished group. It is my honor to introduce our next speaker, who I'm sure many of you know. Ethan Nadelmann is a guy from New York City that I have known since Prop 215 about 20 years ago. And he's one of the most exceptional guys I've ever encountered. He went to the same high school I went to about a decade after I did. But then, unlike me, he went to Princeton and became a professor as well at Princeton before George Soros plucked him out of academia and brought him in to work on open society and drug liberalization ideas. He really is a student of American history. I think that was his subject that he taught at Princeton. And so I would like to remind us all of the great debates in 1787-88, during which time the compromises that led to the creation of the United States were achieved. Not all those compromises were ideal. The 3/5 concerning slaves led to the Civil War, so there were some real problems. Ethan is going to lay out the foundation for what may very well become the united legalization efforts that we will embark on shortly. So without further ado, let me bring Ethan Nadelmann up here.
Knocking on my door saying, hey, yo, yo. Knocking on my door saying, hey, yo, yo. I got a funky new tune with a fly banjo. I can't understand what the problem is. I find it hard enough dealing with my own business.
Okay. Good morning, everybody. For those of you who've been sitting for a while, so I don't want you leaving in the middle of this, so you stand up right now and just stretch out for a moment and, do something with your arms and your legs to get the blood going. And okay, that's enough. So, let me start off by saying this. With as high a level of certainty as I can possibly feel confident in, which is we are going to legalize marijuana in California in 2016. We are going to do it, and we're going to do it right. We're going to do it right, okay? That's what's key. California is pivotal. California is pivotal not just because California is the largest state in the country, not just because all eyes are on California, but because California is going to reverberate nationally and even internationally, right? Now, what that means is that California, it's not just that what you do here is so important. It also means that the way it's done here, the way things work out here, are going to make a big difference for the rest of the country. And so what I want to do here is not give you the specifics of what DPA and Drug Policy Organization, Drug Policy Alliance, what were, the details of this. What I want to talk to you about is the principles that guide us, the principles that drive us, the dilemmas that we're confronting, the issues that we did not anticipate when we first embarked on this journey 2 decades ago, if not more. It's not going to be full of answers in the nitty-gritty sense. It's going to be full of questions and dilemmas that I hope all of you will sort of stop and think about what does this really mean. And I'm going to be as frank and honest as I possibly can be. Right? Not an in-your-face, fuck it, take it, leave it, this way it's going to be, but just how it's playing out. The conversations we're having with my colleagues and with my board and with a whole range of other people, around California and even outside as well. Now, the first thing I want you to understand about both me and the Drug Policy Alliance is that we are first and foremost a human rights organization. That's what drives us. That's why I got involved in this. That's why I built this organization. That's why I'm doing this thing, and that's why I work round the clock to end the war on drugs in America. This is first and foremost an issue of human rights, of personal sovereignty over our own minds and bodies and our own homes, an issue about the notion that nobody should be discriminated against or amongst based simply upon what they put in their body, a notion that it's fundamentally wrong to launch a public policy in which people of color, and especially black people, are disproportionately and negatively affected and discriminated against, that's what drives me. That's what keeps me going, okay? That's what I'm coming from. The second thing I'm going to tell you is that we are not just about marijuana. It's why I was so glad that my friend and board member Carl Hart opened up this conference, right? It's not just about marijuana. And by that, I'm not saying that we think that we should legalize marijuana and legalize all the other drugs in the same way we legalize marijuana, et cetera, et cetera. That's not what I'm saying. But I am saying that what we are seeking to do is to roll back and end the drug war in America and around the world. Right? That is what we're trying to do. And if somebody was to say, Ethan, can you define what DPA is about, what the drug policy reform movement's about, in one sentence? And the answer is, I can. It's a long sentence. And it's not just about freedom, although freedom is the essence of it. But it's this. If one imagines a spectrum of ways of dealing with drugs in our society, from the most punitive, cut off their hands, lock them up, Saudi Arabia, Singapore, what have you, down the spectrum to the most free market, libertarian, no restrictions on anything except sales of kids, Milton Friedman's wet dream, right? I mean, that whole spectrum, right? What we're aiming to do is to reduce the role of criminalization and the criminal justice system in drug control to the maximum extent possible while still protecting and enhancing public health and public safety. It means moving down this spectrum, squeezing out the criminalization, the criminal justice as much as possible, but stopping short at the point where we think that doing so would actually significantly and negatively impact public safety and public health. I am not fighting for the emergence of a new cigarette in American society, and not something that is incredibly addictive and dependent-causing, where people don't fully realize the harms associated with it, and then it's out there for decades, and then it's locked in. I don't want that. The mission of Drug Policy Alliance is twofold. Our first mission is to reduce and ultimately end the harms of drug prohibition, and our second mission is to reduce as much as possible the harms associated with drug use. It's those two missions both. It's not just end prohibition, the hell what happens. It's not just reduce the harms of drugs and try to weave a way of decriminalization into that. Those are the guiding missions in that. When it comes to look, as George said, I'm a New Yorker. I was born in New York. I've been living the last 20 years. I plan to retire in New York if I ever retire, and die in New York so far as I know. I love New York. It's nice being the center of the universe, okay? I got to tell you, right? But that said, for Drug Policy Alliance, California has always been our #1 priority. Right? From the time we got involved in Prop 215 back in '96, from the time when Marcia Rosenbaum opened up our first branch office in San Francisco in '96 and Dan Abramson opened up our National Legal Affairs office in Berkeley, from the time we opened up in Los Angeles in the early 2000s and opened up in Sacramento then as well. And we haven't just been about marijuana. It hasn't just been about medical and legalization and reducing arrests and decriminalization. It's also been about rolling back and ending the other elements of the harms of the drug war. We were proud. I got to tell you something. In '96, after we all won Prop 215, and everybody was slamming George Soros and me and others and the Times and Capitol Hill, right? And you know what my recommendation to George Soros was 3 months later when we were all getting attacked like that? And they were saying it's all subterfuge to legalize everything. I said, George, you know what you got to do? Make a very public commitment. $1 million in funding for needle exchange to reduce the spread of HIV/AIDS. And he said yes, and he did it. And we became the biggest private funder of needle exchange to reduce HIV/AIDS in America in the late 1990s. In 2000, it came time when California's prison population had been growing for decades, and we drafted and wrote and raised the money and won Prop 36. Prop 36, treatment instead of incarceration, so that people getting picked up in possession of a drug who had not a big criminal record, but an issue with drug addiction, could not be sent to jail the first couple of times they got busted. And where we allocated $120 million a year for drug treatment for 5 years and kept that going, and ultimately raised $1 billion for drug treatment, as much as possible outside the criminal justice system, right? If you looked at California's growth of prisons, you will see that after 2000, all of a sudden incarceration dropped for a year or two. And then the prison industrial complex got that prison industrial juggernaut back on the rails, and they began building it up again. But that's why we got involved in 2004 in an effort to stop to reform the three strikes law. It was a flawed initiative. It was better than the flawed three strikes law, and we would have won that if Henry Nicholas, a right-wing billionaire, hadn't put $5 million against us at the last moment. It's why we got behind in 2008, in fact, drafted and built Prop 5. My biggest defeat in my life was Proposition 5 in 2008. That would have been the biggest prison reform in the history of the United States, right? That would have reduced the California prison population by 25,000 to 35,000 people. It would have shifted $1 billion a year from prison and parole to treatment and rehabilitation. It would have held the entire Department of Corrections accountable by the standards that we care about. It basically wove together all the best recommendations from every commission that had looked at prisons and sentencing in California and wove them together in one initiative. We were up 2-to-1 in the poll going in. I raised $7.5 million of hard money from people around the country. Nobody had ever raised that kind of money for criminal justice reform, marijuana reform. You guys think that's easy? Go ahead and try it. Go ahead and try it, raising money from people on the left and the right who care about nothing except trying to reduce incarceration. And in the last 2 months, the California prison industrial complex, the prison guards union, the political establishment across the spectrum ganged up, and they slaughtered us. They slaughtered us. That was my biggest defeat. But we worked hard to reduce incarceration in this country. That initiative had almost nothing to do about marijuana, but it was about ending the criminalization and demonization of other people in the state. It's why in 2010, when Richard Lee put together the initiative to legalize marijuana, and other national organizations were saying, we don't want to help you, wait till 2012, more young people show up. I called Richard, I said, if you're determined to go, I'd rather you wait till 2012, but we will help you. And it means that after Richard put in his money, we led the effort to raise the rest of that money for that campaign, to do the national media. And I will say this about Richard Lee's effort and the initiative in 2010. Am I talking too fast, by the way? I know, you're not New Yorkers here, right? But I will say this. It's very rarely the case that you lose an initiative, but you still win. But in 2010, that initiative, was it Prop 19? Prop 19, I lose track of the numbers now, all these initiatives. That initiative, I think, it lost, but it won, because it transformed the national dialogue. It transformed the national dialogue. And I'll tell you, I basically never thought it could win, with the exception of 1 week, the first week of October 2010, when the polling was still hanging up high. Normally you see the polling dive in October, but it's still hanging up there. I say, my God, this thing might do it. And then it did dive a week later. But nonetheless, I think Richard Lee deserves enormous credit for that initiative in terms of laying the groundwork and moving things forward with that. And laying out his own money to put that thing on the ballot in that way. It's also why in 2012, we did what we could to help the Three Strikes Reform Initiative here. It's also why in 2014, when Prop 47 was on the ballot to reduce incarceration and reduce the penalty for drug possession, from a felony to a misdemeanor and 5 other low-level offenses, it's why we helped with the drafting, helped with the campaign, helped with the fundraising as much as we could. And it's why, ultimately, when I look back last year and say, what am I proud about DPA in California? You know what I'm proud about? We've been fighting for years to end that crack powder disparity in California law. And we did it. We did it, a multi-year effort across the spectrum. We've been fighting for years to make sure that needle exchange programs are legal in California without any sunset provisions. And you know what? We did it. And you know what else we did last year? I don't know how many of you know that last year more people died of a drug-related overdose involving heroin or pharmaceutical opiates than died in an auto accident. right? More. Number one cause of accidental death in America right now is accidental death from opioids, right? There's an antidote called naloxone, which if you give it to people when they overdose, that pops them right back up, right? We want to make that stuff easily, readily available, and California became the second state in the country to say naloxone, that antidote for an overdose, will now be available over the counter in California pharmacies. None of that had to do with marijuana. But that's what we're about. It's about ending the drug war and about fighting for human rights and decency and good public policy, about advancing civil liberties and civil rights. And the reason why I feel so compelled for us to play a key role in the effort to legalize marijuana in 2016, the reason why I stood up at that Normal conference 2 years ago and made a commitment that we are going to do that, is because California has got to do it right. And as the people who are going to be affected by this are not just the people who are the patients in the industry and the growers, it's going to be all Californians who have anything to do with this. It's going to be people who care about the environmental depredations happening from illegal grows in state forests and elsewhere. It's going to be people who are worried about what's happening with the inner cities. It's going to be people who say, well, is it just going to be white people making this and that and white people making all that sort of stuff? It's going to be people worrying about losing their jobs, whether they've been growing quasi-legally gray market or distributing or what have you. It's going to be people in public health and in drug treatment and the medical environment, and even some people in law enforcement who can see their way to step out and break ranks, right, and join with us, who also care about this. It's going to be people who want to see some significant tax revenue come from this industry and see this thing be legally regulated in a responsible way. It's going to be about bringing everybody, as much as we can logistically do, to the table, getting the best possible ideas out there and trying to put together the best, most far-reaching, most winnable, most implementable marijuana legalization initiative that this country has ever seen. That's what we're fighting for. Now, let me tell you, let me here now talk a little frankly about the dilemmas that are emerging, right? Because one of the things we find, and I'll tell you something was difficult. I fought always against the vested interests, those who have the vested interest in retaining prohibition. I fought against the prison industrial complex all my life. The people, the private prison corporations and the prison guards unions and the district attorneys associations and the cops and everybody else who's making a dime and, wanting to keep more people behind bars in order to pad their overtime or, legitimize their jobs or whatever it might be. But you know what gets challenging? Is when a growing number of my allies and a growing number of people who I've oftentimes fought together with develop a vested interest in marijuana prohibition as well. That's hard because we don't have the same sorts of guiding principles to deal with that. When I looked at growers in Humboldt and Mendocino basically voting against Prop 19 some years ago, and I understood, and you talk to someone, they say, Ethan, look, I agree with you about legalizing, but the fact of the matter is we're not going to be able to compete in a legal market once it goes, and I got to protect my livelihood. Where's our guiding principles for dealing with that, right? We'd all been together before these issues got complicated saying, hey, we're fighting for essentially an alcohol model, right? And as many of you heard me say, I'm not fighting for the Budweiserization or Marlboroization of marijuana. I'd like to see a microbrewery or vineyard model emerging in this state and many other places, right? That's my preferred model, okay? But what's our role? What is the obligation to protect and defend those players who have a vested interest in prohibition because they've thrived under prohibition as growers or distributors and are feared about the competition? And part of it is like and meanwhile, those are oftentimes the place where my heart is. But on the other hand, and then I look at other places and say, I went to the Cannabis Business Conference in Las Vegas, in November, and it's overwhelmingly people who have, who have never been involved in this. The people who can be benefiting or profiting are people who never stuck their necks out, who don't have any core civil rights or civil liberties consciousness, right? Who often are looking for money, sometimes a quick buck, sometimes a long-term investment, right? And I stood up there and I said, how many of you ever heard of me before I stood up here? How many of you heard of Rob Camp before I stood up here? Less than half raised their hands. And I basically said, guys, I'm your fucking daddy, and you don't even know it. I said, you think these opportunities just fell off a tree? You think that California and then Alaska, Oregon, Washington, Colorado, Nevada, and Maine all legalized like out of thin air? You think it happened in New York, New Jersey, out of thin air? You think it was like some natural eruption, like somehow created opportunities? Let's go grab it? I said, you guys lie at a unique intersection in the history of American politics. Right? Because what this is right now is a movement that's been driven first and foremost by civil liberties and civil rights and key people who care about public health and public policy and criminal justice reform and racial justice and human rights, resulting in the transformation of emergence of a legal market that is going to be worth many tens of billions of dollars a year very soon. There is nothing else like that in the history of American politics. The movements for gay rights, civil rights, women's rights, those all had major economic consequences, but not the emergence of a brand new legal market. The repeal of alcohol prohibition, a little bit similar, but that essentially reinstituted a legal market that existed only 14 years before. We're talking about something unprecedented. And I said to the guys in the industry, that imposes an obligation on you. I said, when we're moving forward, you know, our first and foremost concern, is that human beings in this world, and especially ours, but human beings, should not be punished in any way for the possession or use of marijuana. That's our first and core. That's where we start from. That is the fundamental human right. That secondly, they should have the ability to get it from a source that is going to be responsible for the quality of the product that they are providing, right? That is second. That thirdly, that to the maximum extent possible, people should be allowed to grow their own damn weed. That being able to grow your own marijuana is something vital. I got to say, I'm a New Yorker. I don't have a green thumb. I can't fully connect to the kind of grow part of this, but I get it. I get it. You know, sometimes I think about, and I said this to the guys in the industry, I said, I think about the anti-gun control movement, the gun rights movement, right? And I say, you know, some of that's about the black helicopters are coming. Some of that's about what the Constitution says, right? But some of that I actually think with guns, right, is almost that visceral, sensual element around holding that gun, that in your hand. It's almost, I don't want to say it's sexual, but I mean, it's just something intimate about that. I don't get that either. I'm a New Yorker, but I get it. And the thing about marijuana and being able to grow your own stuff, I get that one. It is pivotally important, and wherever we can include that, we need to do so. And I said to the industry folks, I said, when you're doing your initiatives, don't regard home grow as competition. How much are the people making a little beer or wine in their backyards competition for the big beer industry or anybody else, or even for the microbreweries, right? There's an ethical obligation. And you know what? I almost got a standing ovation from the industry for saying include home grow in the future, right? Now that's something I think we can bank, and we do it, and we're going to do our best on that sort of stuff. So, first question for you. What's our guiding principles when it comes to protecting those who've been involved in the industry, but, you know, may not survive in a more competitive industry or won't be able to compete for those licenses? What does it mean? Well, Colorado, which had a statewide regulatory system, medical marijuana, made it somewhat easy, right? But it was tougher in Oregon. It's going to be tougher in California. What does it mean to do that sort of thing? You can give preferences, or do you give preferences? Or who does get preferences? There's another initiative out there where, you know, whoever pays is going to get a preference. I don't like the idea of vested interests paying for certain provisions and interests. DPA does not lobby for the industry. We stand for human rights and good public policy. So then I'll tell you, you look at the other initiatives been out there, right? So a lot of times DPA sometimes takes the lead, sometimes we follow, sometimes we played a whole variety of roles in all this sort of stuff, right? You know, if you want to know the initiatives, what happened, you think about what happened in 2011, 2012, Colorado and Washington, right? In both cases, DPA did not initiate that. Right? You know, in Washington, it was initiated by ACLU, Allison Holcomb, folks like that. Graham Boyd, who had represented Peter Lewis, was very involved as well. Right? There were people locally involved as well supporting that thing. Rick Steves will speak here tomorrow, a number of others. Right? And then Colorado, driven by MPP and Steve Fox and Brian Vicente, Christian Cederberg, a range of other, Mason Tvert, range of activists doing that, who had done that for a number of years. And so I had a limited amount of money to raise. Had to make some judgment calls. The polling showed that Washington State had a better chance than Colorado, right till the very end, right, where they landed up being basically even about 55%, right? Rob Campy was raising money for Colorado, right? They needed some. right, Washington State. And Washington State presented a dilemma. Because on the one hand, it contained two provisions which DPA would not write in. One was a ban on home grow, and the other one was a ridiculous drug testing requirement that was not grounded in the science, right? Right? So then we had to do an assessment. Well, how significant, right? We had almost no input on the drafting of that one, right? And then meanwhile, the drug testing thing was there. I basically got some of our key allies, people who did not like that provision, but also looked around the country at other states that also had these kind of zero, tolerance drug testing things. And it turned out that in most of those states, almost nobody was getting busted for that anyway. So it looked like it might be a symbolic provision that stuck in our craw, but that basically wasn't going to have that much impact on the ground. Meanwhile, it was a chance to pop a hole in prohibition nationally. Right? And the situation presented itself. If I put up about a third of the money or so for Washington State, notwithstanding my reservations, that would leverage Peter Lewis and the in-state donors and enable a campaign of $5–6 million to win that thing. And what I said is, yes, I'm going to put that money in there because even though I don't like some of these provisions, even though it may have problems with implementation, and even though we saw some of those things coming up ahead, we could pop a hole in prohibition because that was going to resonate across the country, lay the groundwork for California and other states, and have an even international impact, create the momentum. In Colorado, we were deeply involved in the drafting of that initiative. We were deeply involved on the ground game. We took the lead on advocating in terms of the racial justice elements of that piece. Right? And now we're involved in, because I had office there, on the implementation of that piece, right? We put in some of the money, maybe 10% of the money, right? But that was our role in Colorado. Past year, in Oregon, right? In Oregon, well, basically, we got called in by activists saying, we want to do something here. Travis Maurer had been a grower. He came in, we said, we want to wait till 2016. Right? Brought in Graham Boyd with me, who was representing the same interests of Peter Lewis and his family. And we said, but if the polling knocks our socks off, we'll consider going for 2014, right? The polling knocked our socks off. I realized in retrospect it had been a blip, that the fall of 2013 was a blip in the polling. Because what had happened was Washington and Colorado had legalized. There was all that sense of momentum and possibility. Then Holder had come out with a memorandum in late August, and that meant that the feds were going to give this a chance to move forward. Everybody, polling was polling close to 60% nationally. Even in the South, you were getting to the high 40s or 50%. Oregon was way over 60%, and we were just thinking, damn, wow, amazing. Then, of course, what happens, fast forward after we made the commitment about 9 months later, and all of a sudden the media is focusing on all the difficulties of implementation in Colorado and the nervousness, and Maureen Dowd's doing her wacko shit and sending out stuff and the edibles, and a guy jumps off a roof. And I mean, and all of a sudden, the polling starts to drop nationally in Oregon. And what I also knew was that the downside of losing in Oregon was greater than the upside of winning. Because people sort of expected Oregon to win, right? It's up there in the Northwest. It's liberal. It got so close with a poorly funded, not well-drafted, initiative a couple years before, right? But it got close even with that. But I'm thinking, we've made this commitment now, right? And my biggest fear is overconfidence. People just think marijuana is going to legalize itself. What kind of dream world can people think marijuana is going to legalize itself? People don't remember the late 1970s. I remember going to college in the late 70s. Oh, yeah, marijuana is practically legal. Yeah. Pow! Annual survey of college freshmen in 1979 showed 51% in favor of legalizing marijuana. 10 years later, 1989, 16%, right? Reagan Revolution, conservatives, et cetera. I remember back in 2001, after 9/11, all of a sudden, the country becomes security obsessed and all this sort of stuff, and all of a sudden, our momentum dropped dramatically. I know that at any moment, some other environmental, terrorist disaster could come flip the hell out of America again. Everybody tightens up, gets like this, wants to control, and that's what could happen, right? But you know what? If we lost in Oregon, you know what? You know what that media, and regardless of what Alaska, is an outlier, it's important that it won. Very important that it won. A red state winning for the first time. But if Oregon had lost, we all go, oh yeah, well it won just natural evolution, right? Colorado, Washington, Oregon, Alaska, DC, da-da-da. You know what happened if Oregon lost? What would have been the national headline the next day? Voters turn their back on marijuana legalization. Voters have second thoughts about legalization. Maybe Washington and Colorado are just outliers. Then maybe the Obama administration begins to back up because they don't feel the sense of inevitability anymore. Then our allies in Congress are less likely to be out there. And then all the states that have legalized medical begin to say, well, maybe we got to pull back. And I'd be out there saying, well, wait a second, everybody. It was an awful, it wasn't a presidential election year. The numbers dropped because we didn't have the, young people didn't turn out. The plan's still the same for 2016. All would have been true. But we would have been fighting an uphill battle. And I'll tell you this, if I hadn't raised over $2 million last year for Oregon, almost a tiny fraction of it from people in Oregon, it would have lost. I think it would have lost. These things don't legalize themselves, and it takes real money from people not just in the state and not just in the industry, because a lot of the people in the industry were not putting up real money on this stuff, and a lot of people in the industry, when they put the money up, they want to make sure they get their own little preferences in the whole damn thing, which I don't believe we should be doing as an organization that fights for human rights and good public policy, right? And then Alaska. Rob Campia calls me, asks for help. We're helping, where MPP's taking the lead, we're helping them draft those initiatives. And my deal with Rob is if we like the initiative that results, and if we like the campaign that's happening, and if I got some money to spare, I'll help. So we kicked in $100,000 Alaska in the final analysis, and that may have been what helped make it over the top. DPA didn't lead it, somebody else led it, but we were willing to help. DC, initiative got going with the support of David Bronner and Adam Eidinger, an activist in DC, but DC is 50% African American. And the polling we saw in the summer showed a majority of African Americans were opposed to this thing. So we partnered, we co-led that DC campaign. We took our entire ad budget, poured it into African American media. When that vote happened, over 60% of African Americans in DC voted in favor of that initiative, and both blacks and whites said that racial justice was the #1 reason they voted to decriminalize/legalize marijuana in DC. That's what we did. And you know what else? In Uruguay, when Uruguay decided to do this, and that president bravely said, what's the right thing to do? Within a month, I was sending my people down to help on the drafting, and then one of my people moved out of Uruguay for an entire year to coordinate the effort, the public education campaign among the Uruguayan government, the Uruguayan activists, and the consultants from the US and the experts from Europe in order to do the best possible thing. And I got to tell you, the model they came up with, on the one hand, very low tax price, on the other hand, hyper government control, the stuff that makes you feel ill if you're an American, right? I mean, but nonetheless, we didn't control it. It was for the Uruguayans to decide, but we were going to help that model prevail as well, even though in the American context it looked very, very strange. Because ultimately, it had to be about ending marijuana prohibition. We are involved in a historic struggle right here, both about marijuana and more broadly. It means that we want the details of this thing to be as good as possibly can be, but it means we got to keep popping holes through the prohibitionist edifice. We have 4 states down and 46 to go. We have one country down and 197 or whatever it is to go. When Jamaica started talking about it, I was down there twice, meeting with the senior leadership. I went down there in December, and I spoke to the Negril Chamber of Commerce, and I said to those guys, if you don't get your shit together, you're going to be importing ganja from America before you know it. That was, I got to tell you, that made national headlines in Jamaica. And I don't know if it was my saying that, but the very few weeks later, the cabinet announced its own far-reaching decriminalization in Jamaica. Religious right, medical right, you can bring your California ID to Jamaica and it will be legitimate there, ending the criminalization of possession, okay? I mean, we're playing. So that is what we're trying to do. I'll also say this. When I go and speak at conferences of people dealing with pain, the nurses and the doctors and the industry involved in the pain medication area, most of them involving in opioids and things like that, and I say to them, how many of you are aware fully of the medical literature on the medical value of marijuana in pain? And how many of you recommending it? And only 10 or 20% raise their hands? They get an admonishment and a lecture from me, where I say that they are not fulfilling their ethical obligation as caretakers, as physicians, as nurses, by remaining ignorant of the medical benefits of marijuana. When you have research out there showing that marijuana can substitute for certain types of opiates, and that if you combine the two, you can significantly reduce the amount of opiates you take, and that one reason we may be seeing overdoses dropping in the most robust medical marijuana states is because of that, how can you in good conscience not be a physician and not know this and not be recommending this? And the next day, I go and speak at a cannabis convention. And I hear people standing up there and saying, Damn the opiates. Those things will kill you. They'll addict you. They'll do all these terrible sorts of things. Marijuana is the answer here. And you know what I say? Shut the hell up already. Yes, marijuana is safer. Yes, you can't die of an overdose. Yes, it's not addictive in the way that opioids are. But there are all sorts of pain for which marijuana is not the answer, and for which opioids, variety of opioids, are the answer, whether it's going through surgery and other sorts of intense pain or what have you. This is not about beating up one or the other. When people in the marijuana field, right, sometimes go to normal conferences, and Normal doesn't say this, but others there would be doing it. You know, we gotta legalize marijuana so we can crack down on the other drugs. As Carl Hart said early, no, 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 no. We are not going to legalize marijuana so we can crack down on people using heroin or meth or coke or whatever it might be. We are not going to do that. And when I go and talk to the psychedelics gatherings, I say, listen, I'm with you guys. I agree. When it comes to the upside-downside ratio, psychedelics is unparalleled, even relative to marijuana. When it comes to transformative experience, psychedelics, go, baby, go, you know? I mean, look at that piece Michael Powell in The New Yorker, you know, last week, that amazing piece. Now, there's an interview with him about the medical benefits and spiritual benefits of this stuff. But I say, do not elevate our sacred and wonderful psychedelics above all the others. Because when we speak about the core human right involved here, just as the freedom of speech ultimately cannot distinguish in principle between ugly, racist, horrible speech and the speech that is most elevated, that on some level in a free society, in a First Amendment society, we have to acknowledge the rights of both of those things because we don't want to empower the government to be the one that chooses. The same thing that when it comes to our personal sovereignty over our own minds and bodies, even though those may be more elevated, those may be more helpful, those may be less addictive, those may be more dangerous, we cannot insist or defend a governmental distinction or discrimination between those substances and those substances, between those people who use those and those people who use that. That's what it means to fight for human rights in a free society. So now I gotta wonder here. So in Nevada, there can be an initiative, MPP taking the lead as helping on drafting, but where a preference may be given to alcohol distributors. We know one thing that could kill marijuana legalization is if alcohol folks decide they want to kill it because they got the money to kill what we're doing. Let's not tease ourselves about that. I don't think we need to be putting ourselves in their face. We can say what's true, which is marijuana is less dangerous than alcohol for most people, but no. But on the other hand, if there's a preference, I can see people who've been involved in medical marijuana growing should maybe get a preference for when it comes to the next level, right? But people who are putting money in for their own for-profit interests, I don't know. Creates a dilemma. And then we got the Ohio dilemma, right? You've been following this? Okay, so you know what's happening in Ohio right now. So in the fall, I get a call that there are 10 financial interests, business interests, who are each going to be putting in a total of $20 million to legalize marijuana in Ohio. Pretty impressive, right? I like the sound of this at first gasp. Then it turns out what they're going to do is a constitutional initiative that is going to put into the Ohio Constitution that only the 10 business interests that paid for this will get to be involved on the wholesale side, right? That's what it's happening, okay? There's a few qualifiers that if they don't live up to what they're supposed to do in terms of being in the market, then it can be changed, et cetera. But that's what it's about. So I look at this thing, and they're following the model that was used with casinos. That's what's happened with casinos, as I understand it, with initiatives, is you write it in to favor the preferences. And they ask for our help on this thing. Now, what I know is if we don't offer any help, then it's going to happen without DPA being involved at all. We're just sidelines, and they'll do what they're going to do. If we do provide help, we can make this a stronger, tighter initiative, and it gives us an opportunity to at least try to get them to embrace some of our principles, some of our ways of thinking about this. And this group is somewhat attentive. It's a bipartisan group. They're somewhat attentive. They care about what DPA thinks. They care about these broader issues. There's some ethical conscience wavering in this group here, right? So then I say, we reach a deal. Okay, we will help you with the drafting. right? They already had their draft, but then we're going to help improve it and get our values into this thing. You cannot say that DPA helped, that therefore that implies an endorsement, because we are not at this point going to endorse this thing, right? We're not going to be out there opposing you either. We want to see how this thing plays out, right? So, and you know, basically we're going to promise not to do any he said, she said on this thing, but anybody who knows what DPA stands for is going to know what was in that initiative is consistent with what we believe and what we don't, you know, what we don't believe, right? So now the initiative is out, and it's beginning to get some play there. And so here's the dialogue. Here's what I go on. I say, okay, if this thing doesn't move forward or if it fails, marijuana is going to remain illegal in Ohio for many, many years to come. There were 10,000 to 12,000 marijuana arrests a year last year for marijuana possession in Ohio. And as everywhere else, it's racially disproportionate, right? This initiative wins, and it will now be legal to possess up to an ounce. Most of those arrests are going to go away. And isn't that the fundamental about what we're fighting for? The human right not to be punished for what you put in your body and to possess marijuana, et cetera, right? Then I say, but this damn thing sticks in my craw. I mean, 10 business interests kind of dominating this thing. Then I say, you know, I'll tell you something. We were deeply involved in legislative efforts in New Jersey and New York, and then there was the one in Massachusetts we weren't as involved in. In each one of those things, although we fought for a broader approach, in the final legislative compromise that resulted, it's only a limited number of business interests anyway that are going to get licenses. So maybe it's not that different. Then I say, but this one's written in the Constitution. It's that much harder to change. But then I say, but this one actually, it limits the wholesale, but it's got special protections for medical patients in there. They're very sensitive on that score. And it's not as well drafted as it needs to be on that side, but there's something in there. And it's going to open up tens of thousands, if not more, legal jobs. Because on distribution and on everything else, that's going to be open licenses. There's going to be up to 1,500 licenses for sale in Ohio. I mean, it's going to be a pretty open thing. It's going to bring a lot above the ground. It's going to open up a lot of legal jobs. People are not going to get arrested for possession. But damn, an oligopoly essentially, 10 business interests, right? Well, then I think, so is there any other alternative Ohio? There have been activists in Ohio for a long time. I mean, for a while, I stayed totally out of Ohio because it seemed like there were 7 activists and 12 lawsuits going on. I couldn't keep them all straight, right? Now there seem to be much more credible people doing stuff, but I don't see where they're going to get the money. And I've made my commitment on California. That's going to be a monumental. We want to try to raise $15 million at least. We don't know if there's going to be opposition. We don't know if Sheldon Adelson is going to decide to play here and like he did in Florida. We don't know what's going to happen there. We have to be prepared for what could come down the pike. We cannot assume there's not going to be funded or organized opposition against us. That would be silly and naive and irresponsible on our part. And I can't raise any funding for this thing if people think we're going to be silly or naive about that sort of stuff, right? So then I'm thinking, you know, so the fact of the matter is, and I was talking to one of the activists there a couple of days ago, and I said, listen, I mean, I don't like this oligopoly thing either, but are the activists who have fought all their lives to end marijuana prohibition going to oppose an initiative because it's got an oligopoly on the supply side, even though it's going to open everything else up and give some protections to patients? And by the way, they won't legalize home grow, but they're not going to ban home grow, so home grow can be introduced at some point, anything that's not banned in there, and there is a commission that can review this stuff. That's the dilemmas we're facing now. And then I got an email this morning hearing about another state where I don't see any real money coming for legalization that's looking at the Ohio model. And as far as I can tell, they want to repeal Michigan's medical marijuana. They don't want to have any allowed. They want to ban home grow in the whole initiative. What I see is what we've unleashed now is for-profit interests, big business interests with no connection to this movement are lining up to see what they're going to do about that. And so I go back to my DPA set of principles and I go, is there guidance here for this? And the answer is not really, not fully. Because our own original principles say we advocate for drug policies grounded in science, compassion, health, and human rights. That we are first and foremost concerned about the rights of people to consume and to possess. And as long as that's protected, that's our basis, right? Secondly, about the right of access to legally liable, that's protected in these oligopolistic things. Thirdly, the right of people to grow their own. Well, no. That one in Ohio is not banned, but it may open up down the road. Someplace else. And I'm thinking, how much longer do we all, activists or Drug Policy Alliance or anybody else, have a chance to actually influence the shape of this thing? I talked to a couple of the guys who are running the kind of trade associations, both of whom grew up within the marijuana reform movement, and they say to me, Ethan, you know, at this point, there's still a fusion. I mean, this conference is a model for that, of activists and business interests, right? You know, and they'll still have me or Rob or other people come and speak, or they'll have Ben Cohn from Ben & Jerry's talk about ethically responsible investing. But these guys say to me, our successors in the industry interests probably won't come from within the movement. Basically, what we are unleashing to some extent is basically an end to marijuana prohibition, which is going to be increasingly driven by corporate interests who want to favor their way, and we're going to need to sort of reorganize our core principles around how we deal with this stuff. Because in the end, when I look at the oligopolies, I'm saying, they're doing most of what I want for my core principles, but there's something wrong with it, and I don't like where this thing is going. That's the realities of what we're dealing with now, right? If we don't do this right in 2016, and even if we do, there's a chance that those same forces could come here to California in subsequent years and try to do the same thing again. Better we lock in the best possible, most persuasive, most publicly backed, win by the biggest margin initiative right now, because if this initiative, we win an initiative and it's not responsible, not good, and all of a sudden oligopolistic interests come in and want to do something that's like that, tightly regulated, and then they could win. They could beat what we just won. And then I think, you know, I mean, right? When I look at the polling, and when I look at government, when I look at this, I say, who's got the biggest money to put in this? I've raised almost all my money from people, the Soros, Peter Lewis, John Sperling, George Zimmer, other people who cared about this either from the left or right because of core principles of civil rights, civil liberties, good governance, health, security, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But the real money to win marijuana legalization is going to come from vested interests who want to monopolize the wholesale side of this sort of stuff, right? Well, you know, and you know what else I know? That for that swing voter in the middle, they don't care about, they care a little bit about the rights of patients, what we see. I mean, that moves them, right? But they don't care about the interests that people have been producing in the gray market or quasi-legal medical marijuana. They don't care about that sort of stuff. You know what the swing voter most wants, the person we need to get, that quintessential, you know, 40-year-old, 50-year-old soccer mom from Southern California, or that Latino, you know, parent who's kind of on the edge about this stuff, the people we need to get. You know what they define legalization as? Control. For them, it means control. They see prohibition is out of control, in part because of the work we've done. They sometimes see the whole California medical marijuana thing as out of control. And LA, you know, LA was wide open and beautiful, but you want to know something? The images out of Los Angeles set back the progress of the legalization of medical marijuana around the country by probably what adds up to hundreds of years. When my folks are in the halls of Albany and Trenton, states around the country, and MPBs out there, the number one thing we've had to deal with, the number one thing that pushed us back and caused us to have to come back year after year after year was images of Los Angeles up. This is the face of medical marijuana. And we say, well, wait, look at the other state. Look at Colorado. Look at New Mexico. Look at this. But that image, right? We got to do this thing right. We got to do this thing right. That swing voter is not going to care about a lot of things that we care about as a matter of principle from a human rights perspective or from the gray market protection interests, right? It's going to come by their wanting control. And you know, the people in the government, what are people in government going to want? They're going to want the oligopoly too. Because from their perspective, the fewer the number of providers, the fewer the number of growers, even the fewer the number of distributors, the more big, above-ground, legally regulated interests you have, the easier to regulate. It becomes a much more significant regulatory, much easier regulatory challenge. And if to some extent that is knocking out the black market to some good extent, well, then they're going to like that too. We got to be real about this. We got to be very real about this. So, you know, I'm coming up on this thing. I'm looking at 2016. I don't know what's going to go beyond. You know, MPP's taking a lead in Maine and Nevada, Massachusetts, Arizona. We're helping draft. We'll see how that's going to shake out. Already there's battles brewing in those states over key provisions or things like that. I'm trying to figure out which battles are driven by substance and which are driven by ego. Right? I'm trying to figure out to what extent do I have an obligation, does DPA have an obligation to defend the vested interests who benefit on the marijuana side, not the enforcement side, from the perpetuation of prohibition. These are the dilemmas we're trying to deal with, right? So what I can say about California 2016 is the EPA is committed to raising as much of that $15 or $20 million budget as we possibly can. It is my #1 fundraising priority in California and around the country. It is. We are committed to making this process as absolutely as inclusive as possible. If people want to be drafting a whole bunch of other initiatives and getting their best ideas and building consensus with the communities, we want to know it and we want to hear it, right? If anybody wants to come up to me and say, Ethan, we can win anything in California, damn the polling, I say, okay, I'm not listening to you. If anybody comes up to me and says, all you guys care about is the polling, well, fuck you. Because we're an organization driven by human rights who has led this battle in many ways around the country for a very long time as well. Okay? And you know what else? There are people involved in the environmental community who care about what's going on. There are people who care about civil rights and civil liberties who care about this. There are people in the unions who are willing to support this stuff and care about this. There are well-meaning entrepreneurs who want to put money and support the broader vision, and they care about this. There are political elected officials who care about this. There are thoughtful people working in California government who care about this. There are people in drug treatment and public health who care about this. They all have to get a seat at the table. They all deserve a voice as Californians and as Americans who want to do what's right for California, who want to win the best possible initiative that we can win, that goes as far as possible, that's as protected as possible, that serves the patients, that serves the consumers, that represents a model for the rest of the country. That's my commitment. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. And please, everybody, help. Do we have time for questions?
We have time for some questions.
So what I was going to
suggest
is, how much time do we have all told?
Like 9 minutes.
Why don't we take five or six questions,
5 questions
together, and I'll answer them
as a group. Okay, I have my question first.
Okay.
It's a very simple question.
Seizing the prerogative. Okay.
Can you remind your friends in suits that we are all outlaws to begin with, and if they pass regulations that don't work, it's not really going to have any effect on the market and the things that we do? That's my question.
Okay. Yeah.
You guys, people act like California.
No, there's hands.
Marijuana
There's
doesn't
hands.
need the weed. California needs the weed. You. Oh, right.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. So, Michael Allaire, West Coast Member Services. We're a small collective, and I'm looking at the number that we all know of 1.4 billion revenue in this state. We're not even a percentage of that, or even a percentage of a percentage. But here's a commitment that I'm going to make for us right now. Every budget that we create, every conversation we have with partners in our collectives, every financing entity that we work with now and comes to us in the future, a dedicated line item in our budget will be money for MPP and DPA. We're
Thank you very much.
And I invite,
Thank you.
And I want to be clear, it is the human and civil liberties principles that we stand for, but I also want to be clear, I have self-interest. I want to work in an industry where all the things you just talked about are in fact the environment that I'm working in. My partner and I this partnership is built on principle. So I want you to know that that's what we're going to do, and I invite everybody here to consider.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Let's try to keep it to questions, please. This is the question and answer period. Thank you.
2 questions real quick. The oligopoly that you're talking about, couldn't that be voided by lawsuit after it's established and allow other entities to enter the market? And the second is, have you considered that we might be able to sell protecting the children to Californians by excluding the alcohol, tobacco, and pharmaceutical industry from a 2006 initiative, and thereby allow our locals to get a market share for a year or 2 while we test it in court and beat it? Or they beat us.
I understand.
Indian tribes, America's most tragic human rights. There are 565 tribes, and a good majority are considering opening up their lands to regulation of marijuana. What's your advice for the tribes?
Yeah. Okay, like 2 more, and then, oops, sorry.
Hey, you did great, by the way. My name is Matt Wilson, owner of StayHighlyPositive.com. I'm also a farmer up in Northern California. I've been working in the industry for 4 years in this gray area, I call it, And I just want to know from your brain what I can do with all these guys up in the woods that are afraid of, you know, I'm not going to be able to feed my kid. What can I go back and tell these guys when I go back up the hills to make them feel comfortable where the direction is going and how they can help out in their community and help spread the positive word about cannabis? And thank you very much. You're awesome. I love the energy.
Thank you. Thank you, Matt. Quick question for 2014. There were about 4 competing initiatives. And what our office tried to do is get them together to coalesce around one. We were unable to do that because of differences, whether it was ego or principles. As a result, none of them got funding, none of them made it onto the ballot. I was wondering how you can help deal with that in 2016 so that doesn't happen again.
Yeah, good question.
Okay, I think that's probably 4 or 5. I'm sorry, you guys.
You can do one, I think we have time for 1 or 2 more.
Okay, all right, we'll do this one, and then we'll do Chris, and then that'll be it.
Thanks, Ngayo. Ethan, you talk about raising $15 million to legalize marijuana in California. There's a gentleman who just wrote a $75 million check to San Francisco General Hospital. His name was Mark Zuckerberg. How are you going to get Silicon Valley on board to legalize cannabis in California?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I just wanted, this is Chris Conrad, I just wanted to say thanks, great speech, but also when we talk about Northern California, we have to be careful that it doesn't sound like all of Northern California turned against Prop 19 or anything like that, because there was really pretty close up there. We were within a 4 or 5% difference, and so my question is just how do we create a dialogue that keeps the people who supported us while we're winning the people who were not so favorable? Thank you.
Okay. Okay, well, thank you for those comments and questions. So let me make the following ones. First of all, the Mark Zuckerberg thing, my understanding is that Mark Zuckerberg's just not into this. But some of the other Facebook guys, Sean Parker and Dustin Moskowitz have been supporting DPA in a modest, not so modest way. So I'm optimistic that we can reach into Silicon Valley. Some of those guys got behind Prop 47, the initiative, the sentencing reform one last year. So I think we will make some inroads into this stuff as well. And there are people outside California. Remember, when, you go back to Prop 215, the way that happened, Prop 215 would not have happened if Dennis Perone and a number of others had not gotten together and drafted that initiative. That was the first step. If they hadn't done that, I wasn't jumping in California in '96. And you know what then happened? I get a call in the fall from Ed Rosenthal, saying, Ethan, you got to help. We're close. You got to help. And I say, well, I called Dennis. I say, Dennis, you want any help? He said, no, we want to do is an activist thing. I said, okay. Hung up. A month later, Ed calls me back again. He says, Ethan, what happened? We really need your help. I said, Dennis said he didn't want to help. I said, call him again. He goes. I called Dennis. Dennis says, yeah, we'd like your help. We'd like your help, Okay, come in. Ed's saying we have $50,000. Huh? We look at it, and it turns out, you need 700,000, 435,000 qualified signatures, 700,000. There were 35,000 signatures collected, right? It wasn't going anywhere. And then it became a chance of raising money. George Zimmer stepping up as the one California in-state donor, when then I was able to go to George Soros and Peter Lewis and then John Sperling and say, match this guy, and then go to other guys from outside California. So people outside California care about this happening. They understand the importance. The money's going to come from outside the state and inside. What I would say, on the issue of the Indian tribes, very interesting there, because that really remarkable directive that came out from the Justice Department a few months ago saying the Indian tribes got the right to move forward in this area. Absolutely spectacular. And already the tribes are meeting. One of my colleagues, Amanda Ryman's been, I think, going to one of those meetings. I'll tell you something else really interesting. In Alaska, even though all of the senior Native American leadership up there and the casinos folks up there oppose marijuana legalization, the marijuana legalization in Alaska won a majority of the Native American vote up there, because there is a generational split happening within Native American communities, certainly in Alaska and I assume everywhere else. And younger people understand that marijuana is not booze, it is especially not booze in a Native American context, that it is different, So I think that the more the Native American tribes can get involved in this and hopefully not get involved in opposing, because sometimes the Native American, vested interests in the state have put in money against some of our reforms from a very conservative cultural place, and sometimes because they're in partner with the wrong sorts of people. So I think we need to keep the big Native American money from coming in against us, appeal as much as possible to the younger generation, and encourage them to be stepping up. Without them, of course, what happens then, as with casinos, then they start to oppose anybody else having it. So we need to avoid those kind of vested interests as well growing up there. But I think at this point we want the more the merrier in a responsible way on that front. I'd say, Matt Wilson, with respect to the guys in the woods, and Chris Conrad's point about what do you say? It's tough. I mean, it's like if I, in a previous life, was involved in trying to end alcohol prohibition, what was I going to say to the guys with the backyard stills in Kentucky and Tennessee and everywhere else, growing some booze and making some money, about repealing alcohol prohibition? Right? Because if those guys had looked at it, probably some of them did, they say, hey, we love to drink. We also love prohibition because that's how we're making our money. Right? So at some point, one has to say, we can't guarantee for all the growers up there. And as Chris said, roughly half the people up there did, in fact, support legalization, right? The opposition came from growers who like marijuana but opposed the reform, and from people who are anti-marijuana, right? I think a lot of this comes down to going back to basic principles. Can you, in good faith, vote to continue with marijuana prohibition in this state? Can you continue with that? Marijuana is being decriminalized. Now people are getting infractions, but there's still a lot of people getting infractions all around this state. And once again, it is overwhelmingly young men of color who are getting nailed for this stuff. Can you in good faith defend that? There are all sorts of people around this state who don't live in a medical marijuana-friendly jurisdiction. They're having a hell of a time. Can you in good faith defend that? There is litigation in the courts that could start screwing this stuff up. You got Fresno banning home grow. You got stuff going on. There's lawsuits by other states as well. This stuff, the people who say, hey, we want to protect what we got, one thing you got to remember, that what we got in California today is inherently unstable. There's going to be new people in the White House 2 years from now, and I don't see anybody on the horizon with a really good chance. I mean, you want to say Rand Paul's got a good chance, but apart from that, who's going to be, as sympathetic as Obama and Holder have been on this sort of stuff, right? There is the risk of a backlash. There's the risk of litigation going the wrong way and the Supreme Court coming down the wrong way. I remember going back to Montana in the middle part of the last decade, and people were going, hey, man, it's open. People were conventions in hotels. First time I ever saw marijuana plants in a hotel conference hall, like in 2006 or something, right? And Montana almost got wiped out by the change in political parties and the popular rejection of that stuff getting out of hand, right? I want many of you to remember that when we won Prop 215, a month later, the federal drug czar stood up with the head of HHS and other agencies and the head of NIDA, and they basically said, we're going to go after any doctor who recommends marijuana and maybe patients. And DPA, together with Graham Boyd and the ACLU, sued their butts in federal court. We got a temporary restraining order, a preliminary injunction. We won in federal court. We won in appeals court. And we won the constitutional First Amendment right to discuss medical marijuana. You know something? In fact, I'll tell you. At a time, sweetest contribution I ever got was a $325,000 check from the federal drug czar's office reimbursing us for our attorney's fees in that case, right? So,
yes.
The last point I want to say is the following. One other thing I want to say is, 2 years ago, DPA, together with a few others, made a rapid-fire attempt to sort of get an initiative on the ballot in 24, at least to draft one, right? We knew going in the odds were against us even going to collect the signatures. We knew it would be our money. And I want to, what I know is that effort generated a lot of distrust. And I want to apologize for that. Because quite frankly, at that moment, I was saying the polling is rock hard right now. It's going to be crazy in 2016. You never know what's going to happen. Let's seize the moment, And we said, let's draft this thing. And then we said, no. It needed to be a more participatory process. It needed to be in a whole other way. So I apologize to those of you who were freaked out and weirded out by what DPA did. I want to apologize. That is not what is going to happen this time. We are going to make this process as inclusive as possible. Listen to any good idea on the table. And guys, please, California, it's not just about California. It's primarily, I know, for here, but for the nation. When I go to Mexico and I say, what will change the situation in Mexico where 100,000 people have been killed in these drug wars? You know what people say to me? Legalize marijuana in California. And I say, what about Washington, Colorado? That helped. What about Oregon, Alaska? That helped. Legalize it. If you do it in Texas, even better, but you can't do it there. Legalize it in California. So let's do it right. I hope I can all count on your support, and we'll be in a good faith place on here.
Ethan Nadelmann. Ethan Nadelmann. One more time. Ethan Nadelmann.
Thank you very much.